There's one more mapping I want you to be aware of, although I will only address it very lightly, which is EF-Core's ability to map complex types and, by extension, value objects. First, I should make sure you understand what I mean by a complex type. Sometimes you want to create and store your own types that are more than a scalar type, but you don't need them to be their own full entity with a key and the overhead of relationships. We've seen a simple example of this with contact details, but now we're going to go deeper. Consider, for example, the names of the author and artist. Already we have first name and last name in both classes. What if we also want to make sure it's easy to get the full name? So I've added a full name property to both classes. Each of these, by the way, is using an expression body to return that combined name. As I think of more and more great things I might want to do with name, then I have to return to every class in my model that has a first and last name and keep adding these new properties and methods. So rather than having to do that, we can combine all of them into their own type. Here's the example, person name. Note that this type does not contain a key. Since it's going to be used as a property of other entities, it's those entities' keys that will drive persistence. Person name would never be stored and retrieved on its own. It's simply a property of author and artist. And I can easily add more logic to that, like this reverse property, without having to add that to every class that has a name. EF-Core is not going to understand this by default, though. It will assume that person name is an entity in a relationship with author and a relationship with artist, and it'll throw an exception complaining that person name needs a key property. To correct this, we need to add configurations in the pub context, just as we did for the complex type that maps to a JSON string in a single field. But for complex properties, we have the complex property method and pass in a lambda representing the name property. By default, the way that EF-Core persists this is that the properties of the complex type, in other words, the first and last name, become their own columns within the table of the type that owns them. The full and reverse properties don't get mapped because they're read-only. I don't even have to tell the DB context to ignore those. You can also nest complex properties. And in the downloads, you'll find some additional address types and how I've applied those as nested complex properties. Many developers rely on concepts from domain-driven design, and a very important concept there is called a value object. A value object is a complex type that has some more attributes, and the complex property mapping does them much better justice than owned entities has been doing. There are a lot of reasons that complex properties are much better than owned entities. Chief among them is that there are less side effects and they support more usage scenarios. This is my favorite new feature in EF-Core 8, and I will devote plenty of time to it in the EF-Core and Domain-Driven Design course that targets EF-Core 8. There's much more to learn from the docs, as well as from a brilliant deep dive community stand-up with the EF-Core team, and I'll link to both of those at the end of this module. This module gave you insights into conventional and additional mappings that you should be aware of and that you can follow up on as needed. You should now know enough to be able to take them into consideration as you plan how to persist your application data with EF-Core. We looked at how EF-Core maps nullable reference types when your project enables NRT support. Then I give you a quick look at data annotations for applying configurations. And I'm more interested in your being able to comprehend them when you're reading code samples or other people's code. However, I'm not keen on using them over the Fluent API. You learned a bit about EF-Core's support for persisting complex types and collections of primitive types into JSON in your database, and using value conversions to help EF-Core persist types, sometimes types that you want to persist differently than it wants to, for example, saving enums as strings rather than integers, or even types that don't have a database counterpart, such as my favorite, .NET's color struct. Then you learned about EF-Core's support for bulk configurations and conversions. And finally, about the complex property mapping for persisting complex types in their own column in the database table, as opposed to compressing them into JSON that we learned earlier. And just as a reminder, the download only has one solution because we didn't do a walkthrough. The next module is another overview, this time focusing on EF Core's database connectivity, so you can get a high-level understanding of things like how you can switch databases on the fly. As always, here are some links to resources that I mention in this module. I'm Julie Lerman, and thanks again for watching Entity Framework Core Fundamentals.